The air was thick with fog as the morning sun struggled to break through the mist that clung to the trees. The small, rural town of Ashbrook, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, had always been a place of secrets and isolation. Here, the roads twisted like the veins of the earth, leading only to homes that were half forgotten by time. Among these homes, one stood out in its eerie stillness, the Langford House, perched on a lonely hill at the edge of town. The Langford House had been there longer than most of the residents could remember. It was a crumbling structure, with the weathered wood groaning under the weight of history. The roof sagged in places, the once vibrant paint now peeling away like the memories of those who had lived there. It looked abandoned, yet it never was. A faint light in the windows at night was the only indication that someone still lived there. Hello everyone. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from and at what time. This way, YouTube will continue to show you more stories like this. The Langfords were a family shrouded in mystery. They were not well known in town. Despite having lived there for decades, the couple, James and Ruth Langford, were quiet, reclusive people. They had no close friends, no visitors, and no interaction with the outside world. They rarely attended town events, and when they did, it was always at the farthest corner of the gathering, their presence barely noticed. James, a tall, gaunt man with a stern face and dark, sunken eyes, was often seen walking around the property, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the ground. Ruth, a frail woman with graying hair and a voice that hardly carried, spent most of her days in the house, tending to the gardens or cleaning the windows. They were like shadows, moving through their world as if untouched by time. The few people who had ever spoken to them said little of note. They were polite but distant, always quick to end conversations with awkward silences or hurried goodbyes. But in a town where gossip spread faster than fire, rumors about the Langfords had begun to take root. Whispers fluttered through the streets, passed from one house to the next, always in hushed tones, as if saying the words out loud would somehow summon the dark secrets they spoke of. Some said that James and Ruth had no family outside of their home. Others claimed that their children, if they had any, were locked away from the world for their own safety. There were even darker rumors, the most persistent one being that the couple were not just husband and wife, but siblings too, bound together by a twisted bond that had lasted for generations. No one dared confront them about these rumors. Of course, Ashbrook was a town that valued silence above all else, but the air around the Langford house had begun to feel heavy, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The trees around the property stood like silent sentinels, their branches reaching towards the house like skeletal hands. The river that ran nearby had an odd, stagnant quality, the waters never quite as clear as those elsewhere in the town. Even the birds seemed to avoid the area, as if the place itself carried a warning that no one could ignore. Yet despite the oddities, life went on. The townsfolk carried on with their daily routines, as people always do when faced with the uncomfortable knowledge of something they cannot or will not understand. They simply avoided the Langfords, pretending they were no different than any other family who chose to live on the outskirts. But the truth, as it always does, had a way of creeping out of the shadows. And so the Langford house stood like a ghost haunting the edge of town, waiting for the moment when its secrets would finally be exposed. The sun had barely risen over the mountains, and the town of Ashbrook had already begun its daily rhythm. The streets were quiet, the air cool and crisp as it whispered through the leaves of the trees. Yet, despite the calm of the morning, there was a palpable tension hanging over the town. It had been building for months now, ever since the townspeople began to notice the peculiarities surrounding the Langford family. At first, it was the children. They had always been kept inside, never seen outside the house unless accompanied by James or Ruth. But one spring morning, as the buds on the trees began to bloom, a small group of children from the town wandered down the road near the Langford house, their voices rising in a playful melody. They had always heard strange noises coming from behind the walls of the old house, whispers, crying, and the occasional thud. They had often speculated about the family inside, but it wasn't until that day that they finally saw something strange. The eldest Langford child, a girl named Lydia, stepped out onto the porch. She was no older than 16. Yet her face looked older, tired, as though the years had weighed heavily upon her. Her skin was pale, almost ghostly, with a strange, unnatural hue that stood out in contrast to the green of the forest behind her. Her eyes were dark, but not in the usual way. They were sunken, hollow, giving her an almost alien look. Her thin lips stretched into a tight smile as she waved at the children. But there was something off about her gesture, too quick, too forced. The children froze. They had never seen her outside before, and her appearance, her odd, pale skin and the unnatural stillness of her movements struck them as wrong. They quickly turned and scampered back up the road, whispering frantically about what they had just witnessed. From that day onward, Lydia was a subject of fascination for the children of Ashbrook. The more they talked about her, the more they realized that she was different from the others. She never seemed to speak much, and when she did, her words were almost inaudible, as if she were afraid of being heard. Her gait was unnervingly stiff, as though every step was calculated, every movement forced. It wasn't long before the adults in Ashbrook began to take notice. A few ventured to the Langford house, hoping to catch a glimpse of the family, or perhaps ask a simple question about their unusual behavior. They saw James and Ruth as they always had, quiet, reserved, with faces that rarely showed any emotion. But it was the children who drew the most attention. They had begun to grow, but not in the way that was expected. They were abnormally tall for their age, yet their movements were disjointed and uncoordinated, as if their bodies were struggling to catch up with their growth. One day, a local doctor named Dr. Edward Campbell, who had treated some of the townsfolk for years, happened to visit the Langford house to check on a minor illness. He was no stranger to strange circumstances in Ashbrook, but when he saw the children for the first time, his professional curiosity turned into something darker. They were all sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the walls, their eyes glazed over as though lost in some internal world. There was an unnatural stillness about them, something deeply unsettling. It was only when one of the children, a boy named Samuel, looked up at him that Dr. Campbell felt a chill crawl up his spine. Samuel's eyes were empty, devoid of any recognition, as though the child had not seen him as a person, but simply as an object passing by. There was no warmth, no curiosity, only a strange emptiness. Dr. Campbell left the house with a sense of dread hanging over him. He couldn't shake the image of Samuel's vacant gaze. Something was terribly wrong with the Langford children. And he knew it wasn't just poor health. There were signs of genetic abnormalities that pointed to something more sinister. The children's deformities weren't just physical, their behavior was abnormal too. The quiet, unemotional way they interacted with each other and with outsiders was unlike any family he had ever encountered. The doctor's mind raced as he considered the possibilities. There had always been whispers, of course rumors about the Langfords' family history, their isolation, and the strange behaviors of their children. But what if those rumors weren't just gossip? What if they were true? What if the Langfords were a family bound by more than just love? What if they were inbred? The word echoed in his mind, filling him with a sense of dread. The thought of incestuous relations was enough to send a chill through any community. But here, in Ashbrook, where the town was so small and insular, the consequences could be even worse. He knew that the Langfords had lived in isolation, but the degree to which they had kept to themselves began to make sense now. The deformities, the strange behaviors, these were the marks of generations of inbreeding, hidden in plain sight. The doctor hesitated, unsure of what to do with the knowledge he had. The townsfolk had been gossiping for years, but no one had dared to confront the Langfords about their secrets. Now, the children were growing older, and the reality of what had been hidden for so long was becoming clearer. Something had to be done. But as he sat in his office that evening, Dr. Campbell realized one unsettling truth: nothing could be done. The Langfords had lived in their isolated world for so long, and their secrets had burrowed so deeply into the fabric of Ashbrook, that to expose them would tear the town apart. The fear of what they had done, what they had become, would be too much for the fragile community to bear. As night fell, the fog once again descended on Ashbrook. The town seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. And deep in the Langford house, behind walls that had been standing for decades, the truth waited quiet, hidden, and far more terrible than anyone could have imagined. It was the fire that changed everything. Ashbrook had never seen a fire quite like this one. It started as a faint plume of smoke that curled up into the pale sky, unnoticed by the townsfolk at first, but soon. The smoke thickened and darkened, twisting into a cloud that could not be ignored. A wave of heat began to emanate from the direction of the Langford house, reaching the town like a distant, invisible hand. By the time the first cries of alarm were heard, the house was already burning. Neighbors rushed to the scene, the streets filled with the frantic sound of footsteps as they tried to help. But the flames were fierce. The fire spread quickly, devouring the wooden house, and the air was thick with the acrid stench of smoke. The townsfolk stood at a distance, unsure of what to do. They had heard of fires before, of houses left to burn to the ground. But there was something different about this one. There was something foreboding in the air, something that seemed to pull them back, urging them to stay away from the place they had long avoided. James and Ruth Langford had been inside the house when it caught fire. They were the only ones who lived there. The children, as always, remained hidden from view, and no one had seen them outside for days. When the firemen arrived, it was already too late for the house, but they managed to extinguish the flames before they spread to the surrounding woods. But what they found inside the charred ruins would forever alter the fate of Ashbrook. At first, there was nothing, just the remnants of the house, the collapsed beams, and the smoldering debris. But as the firemen sifted through the wreckage, their search turned up something unexpected. Underneath the remains of the living room floorboards, they discovered a hidden trapdoor. Beneath it, there was a narrow staircase leading into the cold darkness of a forgotten cellar. A low, sickly smell hung in the air, mixed with the lingering scent of burnt wood. The firemen descended cautiously, their flashlights piercing the darkness as they revealed what lay hidden beneath the house. The cellar was small, crammed with old furniture and shelves filled with dusty jars. But it was what was in the far corner of the room that caught their attention. There, on a small table, lay a collection of old photographs, some yellowed with age, others crisp but faded. But it wasn't the photos themselves that were unsettling, it was the people in them. The faces stared back at the firemen with blank eyes, eyes that were too large for their faces, eyes that seemed empty, hollow. They were the faces of people who should have been long-forgotten faces that belonged to generations past. But one photograph stood out more than the others. It was a portrait of a young woman, standing beside a man who could only be James Langford. But what was chilling wasn't the sight of the couple. It was the child standing between them. The child was Lydia. The fireman recoiled, staring at the photograph in disbelief. The woman in the photograph was Ruth Langford, but the child, a young Lydia, was standing there as if it were some sort of twisted family portrait, one that never should have been taken. What was even more disturbing was the next photograph. They found a shot of Ruth and James, much older now, standing with their other children. Their faces were contorted in unnatural ways, their bodies distorted, deformed. It was a grotesque image, one that would haunt anyone who saw it. As the firemen examined the photos, they began to notice something even more disturbing. Each of the children in the pictures had a striking resemblance to the others. There was no mistaking it. These children were not just relatives, they were siblings, born of the same bloodline. The truth was undeniable now. James and Ruth Langford had been hiding their twisted history for years. The family was inbred, a legacy of generations spent locked away from the world. The Langford children, all of them, had been born to parents who were siblings, their bodies and minds forever scarred by the sins of their ancestors. Word spread quickly through Ashbrook. The Langfords' secret, once whispered about in hushed tones, was now laid bare for everyone to see. The town, which had kept its distance for so long, now found itself caught in the web of the family's dark history. People who had once avoided the Langfords in silence now found themselves compelled to speak out, to react to the terrible truth they had uncovered. As the truth spread, the town was plunged into a state of disbelief. The image of the Langford children, deformed, twisted, and broken, was burned into their minds. But it wasn't just the physical deformities that terrified the townsfolk. It was the realization that this horror had been hidden in plain sight for so many years, that such a thing could have happened without anyone truly knowing. The Langfords were no longer the quiet, reclusive family they had once been. Now, they were the focus of a town's fear and disgust. The community's collective heart sank as they realized the scope of what had been kept from them. For years, they had lived alongside a family whose dark, twisted secrets were hidden just beneath the surface. waiting to be revealed in the most horrifying way possible. As the Langford house smoldered in the distance, Ashbrook stood at the edge of something much darker than they had ever imagined. What they thought was a quiet, isolated town was now stained by the truth of what had occurred in the Langford home. The neighbors had lived beside them for years, oblivious to the terrible truth that had festered behind those walls. The fire had burned away the facade, but it was only the beginning of what was to come. The discovery of the Langford family's horrifying secret spread through Ashbrook like wildfire. Once the initial shock had worn off, the anger and fear began to grow. What had once been whispered about in the dark corners of the town now lay exposed for all to see. The Langfords were not just an isolated family, they were the product of generations of abuse, and their twisted history could no longer be ignored. The townspeople's response was immediate and unforgiving. It was as though the discovery had cracked something deep within them, unleashing years of pent-up fears and prejudices. People who had once shared a friendly wave with James and Ruth now crossed the street to avoid them, as if proximity to the Langford house itself might infect them with some terrible curse. No one could look at the Langfords the same way again, not after the photographs. Not after the truth about the inbreeding, the genetic deformities, the lies that had been hidden for so long. And it wasn't just the adults who recoiled. The children of Ashbrook were terrified. They had heard the rumors, whispered in hushed voices by their parents, but none of them had truly understood the extent of what had happened until now. They had seen Lydia, Samuel, and the others from afar, but now, the stories had become real, the strange. Pale children who had always kept to themselves were now a symbol of fear for the entire town. Some tried to distance themselves from the situation, insisting that they had no part in the Langfords' tragedy. They hid behind closed doors, refusing to acknowledge the truth, hoping that it would somehow disappear if they ignored it long enough. But others, driven by fear and a need for justice, took a different approach. A few town leaders, fueled by a mix of anger and self-righteousness, decided that the Langfords could not remain in Ashbrook. The family had to leave, or they would be forced out. And so, the pressure on James and Ruth grew. They had never been popular in Ashbrook, but now they were outcasts more than that. They were monsters in the eyes of the community. The couple, who had once lived in quiet isolation, now found themselves surrounded by the furious stares and bitter whispers of a town they had never truly been a part of. The children, hidden away for so long, now found themselves subjected to a cruel new reality. In the days that followed, the Langfords withdrew further into their home. The once strong walls of their isolation had been shattered, and the family was now a shell of what it had been. Ruth, who had always been quiet, seemed even more withdrawn, her frail form hunched over in the shadows of the house. James, whose stoic nature had once kept the townsfolk at arm's length, now seemed like a broken man, his face etched with guilt and sorrow. But it wasn't just the family that was breaking. Ashbrook itself was beginning to crumble under the weight of what it had uncovered. The town that had once prided itself on being close-knit and silent was now divided. Some supported the Langfords, quietly murmuring that they should be left to live out the rest of their lives in peace, while others demanded their immediate removal from Ashbrook. The divide grew wider each day, each person more certain that their version of justice was the right one. Amidst this turmoil, Lydia and her siblings began to emerge from their isolation. They were not the same children they had once been, and the town was not the same place it had been when they were hidden away. The children wandered the streets in a daze, their movements slow and unsure, their eyes vacant, as if they were searching for something they had lost long ago. They were no longer the strange, odd children of the Langford house. Now, they were symbols of the brokenness of Ashbrook, a reminder that the horrors of the past never truly stayed buried. But it was Lydia who captured the most attention. She had been the first to emerge from the house, the first to show herself to the world. She wandered the streets like a ghost, her pale face a haunting reflection of the life she had lived in secret. The town watched her from their windows, their gazes filled with a mixture of fear and pity. No one dared speak to her directly, but everyone had something to say behind closed doors. She had become the embodiment of Ashbrook's darkest secrets. The Langfords, now completely isolated from the community, had nowhere to turn. They had been cast aside, their lives unraveling in the wake of the revelations. Their world was falling apart. And yet, for the first time in years, they were forced to confront what they had kept hidden for so long. James and Ruth, their bond forever tied by blood, were now more isolated than ever. They were a family that had once lived in secret. But now, they were being dragged through the streets of their own town, their past laid bare for all to see. For the children, it was too late. The damage had already been done. The stigma that clung to them was something they could never escape. They were born into a legacy of shame. And no amount of hiding or running could ever undo what had been done to them. They had lived in the shadows for so long, and now, in the light of truth, they were left to face the world they had never truly known. The Langfords were no longer a family, they were a symbol. A reminder of the darkness that could be hidden behind closed doors, of the things people were willing to ignore in order to maintain their sense of normalcy. But as Ashbrook began to turn its back on them, one final question hung in the air. What would happen to the Langfords now? What became of a family whose very existence had been predicated on a lie? A family whose secrets had consumed them from the inside out? The answer, though uncertain, was clear enough. The Langfords' story had only just begun to unravel, and the town of Ashbrook would never be the same again. The days following the collapse of the Langford family's existence in Ashbrook were quiet, yet the town was far from peaceful. Whispers lingered in the air, swirling like the autumn fog that rolled through the streets in the early mornings. The town, which had once prided itself on its strong sense of community, now felt fractured, broken into pieces that could never quite be put back together. The Langfords, though gone from the public eye, had left a mark that could never be erased. James and Ruth had disappeared, leaving no trace behind except for the hollowed-out remains of their home. No one knew where they had gone, and no one cared enough to search for them. Their house, now nothing more than charred timber and rubble, stood as a grim monument to the secrets they had kept hidden for so long. The remains of the fire had long since been cleared, but the emptiness remained. It was as though the house had never truly been there at all, a mere illusion that had vanished with the flames. The Langford children, once confined to the shadows, now wandered the streets like lost souls. Lydia, the eldest, had become a ghost in her own right, her presence both haunting and sorrowful. She would walk through the town in the late hours of the night, her head down, her eyes vacant, as if searching for something she could never find. The others, Samuel, Emily, and Thomas, were rarely seen. The town had grown used to their absence, though their names were still spoken in hushed tones, often with pity, sometimes with fear. As the weeks turned into months, the town's memories of the Langfords faded, but the scars they had left were deeper than anyone realized. Ashbrook had a way of forgetting, of moving on when it needed to. But some things could not be erased from memory. Some truths were too dark, too unsettling to let go. It was during one particularly heavy rainstorm that the true cost of the Langfords' secret was revealed. The ground near the old house, soft from the storm, began to give way, and a deep crevice opened up where the foundation had once stood. A group of curious townsfolk, drawn to the noise of shifting earth, gathered to investigate. What they discovered beneath the ground would send shockwaves through the town, a hidden vault, concealed for decades beneath the house. Inside the vault were more photographs, more letters, more records of the Langford family's twisted past. There were diaries detailing Ruth and James's early years, their descent into isolation, and their eventual decision to live outside the bounds of normal society. The documents were filled with unsettling confessions, written in Ruth's delicate hand, confessing to the horrors she and her brother had committed. The records painted a disturbing picture of a family bound by more than just love, but by a dark, unspoken curse. The discovery was a devastating blow to Ashbrook. It was as if the town had been forced to confront a monster it had refused to acknowledge for years. The legacy of the Langfords, their sickness, their isolation, and their twisted need for each other had been hidden beneath the surface. And now it was impossible to ignore. The photographs, once thought to be isolated memories, now spread through the town like an infectious disease. People who had once turned a blind eye to the Langfords' oddities now found themselves grappling with the truth. But even in the wake of these revelations, no one truly knew what to do. The Langford house had been abandoned, and the family was gone. Their children, broken and lost, had vanished into the world, leaving behind only the wreckage of their twisted legacy. And yet, the town was left to pick up the pieces, to deal with the unspoken knowledge that something had been terribly wrong for far too long. As time passed, Ashbrook began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The whispers faded, the photographs were locked away, and life slowly continued. But for those who had witnessed the fall of the Langfords, the scars remained. The story of the inbred couple who lived in secret for decades was one that would never be forgotten. And in the years that followed, the Langford name became synonymous with the darkest kind of tragedy. Their story would be passed down through the generations, whispered in the same hushed tones that had once surrounded their family's existence. The house, now a pile of rubble, would stand as a chilling reminder of the horrors that can hide in the quietest corners of a town for Ashbrook. The legacy of the Langfords was a haunting one, a warning that sometimes the things that are buried the deepest are the ones that come back to haunt us. The last remnants of the family were sealed in the vault beneath the house, their names, their faces, and their history locked away in darkness, never to see the light of day again. But in the quietest moments, when the fog rolls in, thick and heavy, the echoes of their story still linger. And for those who dare to listen closely, there's a whisper on the wind, a reminder that some secrets are never truly gone.